For the past several years, the Fraternal Order Police has been sounding the alarm about the nationwide surge in crime. All across this country, our communities are seeing real-life and often deadly consequences of rogue prosecutors failing to hold violent, repeat criminals accountable. When rogue prosecutors like George Gascon in Los Angeles, Tim Foxx in Chicago, and Larry Krasner in Philadelphia choose to hand out a slap on the wrist to serious offenders, criminals become emboldened. They commit acts of violence knowing that they will not face significant consequences for their actions. Law-abiding citizens should have no patience for public officials who undermine the work of law enforcement agencies, especially when crime and violence is impacting so many lives. Prosecutors in too many jurisdictions are abusing their authority by imposing a social agenda instead of enforcing the law. Across the country, leaders of the Fraternal Order Police are fighting back against rogue prosecutors and activist judges because Americans should not have to live in fear. Today, we're joined by Tim Shea, former acting administrator for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Prior to serving at DEA, Tim served as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia during the Trump administration. In that capacity, he led the largest U.S. Attorney's office in the country, responsible for prosecution for both federal and local crimes in the District of Columbia.
I'm Patrick Ayers, National President of Fraternal Order Police, and this is The Blue View.
Well, Tim, thank you for joining us on The Blue View. I have to tell you, I've enjoyed working with you over the years. Just your insight on so many different aspects of the criminal justice system has been very, very helpful to the Fraternal Order Police. So thanks for coming with us today to kind of share your thoughts on a rising crime across this country, and some of the factors that are creating this the increase in cities across the country. But before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to be here with you. We've worked together over the years. I've actually been associated with FOP for many, many years, and going back to my first time at the Justice Department in the early '90s, which is where I started at DOJ as a Associate Deputy Attorney General, then as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. And it's interesting because at that time, crime was through the roof then. We hit some of the highest crime rates in the history of the country back in the early '90s. And the surge was real, and it was felt, and it was caused in some ways by a lot of the same problems we have today, which is, lax sentencing and bail reform and other things that accounted for a lot of the increase in crime. At that time, the Berlin Wall fell. So we at Justice at the time realigned our resources to focus them on violent crime. So the FBI and other agencies that were doing anti-Soviet stuff, there was no more Soviet Union. So we ended up focusing that on violent crime. Then there was laws enacted by Congress and others that increased penalties. And over the next 25 years or so, crime started to go down. And there was no accident. I mean, there was more people in jail, it's true, but the crime was a lot lower. And now you're seeing, a change where we're seeing an uptick in a significant way around the country, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So when we look at these, in many ways, it's a tale of two cities. I look across this country, and you have cities, large cities that are doing quite well. They have a holistic approach where all of the spokes in the wheel of the criminal justice system are working together, and we see low crime rates. Yet we see cities the same size where there are a number of factors of people working in different directions that have their own ideologies on how whether it's be social reform or whatever, or activist DAs or judges. We're seeing those are the cities that are having the highest crime rate. So can you contrast that back to the '90s? To where we are now, and what's the difference between then? What do you see is our present day challenges that we have, or why we see crime on a steady rise?
Right. One of the big differences, and I think you pointed out, is that there's sort of a social justice agenda that is really affecting people directly through the crime rate, and you're seeing that starting with the defund the police movement that has impacted just the numbers of police officers on the street, but the morale of police officers, the ability to attract good people to the forces. And I think that's been a problem. I think you've seen a lax bail laws where they've relaxed the bail laws around the country, New York and other places, or these activist DAs will go in and charge people lesser offenses that don't require bail. So people are out on the street, and that contributes to the revolving door of justice. You're seeing lower sentences, people trying to ratchet down the sentencing, not only the guidelines, but the enhancements, not charging the enhancements like extra gun charges and the things that we normally do. And that's what resulted in a lot of the decreases in crime in the 90s. And so you see, because in the end, what happens is that most of the crime in this country is committed by a small number of people. And if you get those people, if you incapacitate them for a certain amount of time and protect society, you're going to lower the crime rate. And that's what we did. The other thing I'll make a plug for, based on my previous background at the DEA, is drug trafficking contributes to this violent crime problem. Every police officer and chief I talked to around the country when I was administrator would talk about how the drug trafficking is contributing to the violent crime in their neighborhood. It's a tool of the trade, violence to maintain their market share. Every search warrant that the DEA executed, found guns. I mean, it's one of those things. The other thing that's not mentioned a lot, and I think it's violence, is the OD deaths in this country. You're seeing, because of the flood of drugs from Mexico primarily, 107,000 people a year dying from overdose deaths. That's a record, a history of this country. Most of that's from fentanyl. In fact, of the Americans that are 18 to 45 years old, the highest cause of death in this country is fentanyl. I mean, more than anything else, and that's incredible. So to me, that's also contributing to the violent crime in addition. But that's also part of this agenda, because you have these people, and it always burned me as a DEA administrator to people talk about nonviolent drug offenses. Well, there are no nonviolent drug offenses if you're a dealer, right, because you perpetuate violence through the trafficking of drugs and through the victims that you kill. Kids in their beds at their home having a fake OxyContin pill that's laced with fentanyl. That happens all the time. I talk to parents about that. It was a tremendous problem. It still is today, and that's contributing to it as well.
Yeah, and you touched on something that is so true. It's something I've been saying, and anyone in law enforcement knows this. You're right. It's a small percentage of people who are doing a violent crime, the most violent crime in this country, and the problem is that the revolving door is putting them back on the street. And just a few weeks ago, 2 different incidents, we lost 3 police officers of people that law enforcement took off the street because they were violent offenders. There were gun violations involved, and got slaps on the wrist, and went back to continue to victimize their communities, and in those 2 instances lost 3 officers because of it. But it's not just law enforcement officers. This is happening in communities every single day. These same people are going back and protecting the very communities that these activist DAs and activist judges are really thinking that they're helping. They insist that they're helping the Black and brown communities, the ones that are disproportionately affected more by these decisions. As a prosecutor, I mean, we all know this. This is obvious. It's for some reason it baffles my mind that prosecutors do not see that the same exact people are creating a revolving door. Do they have no conscience of seeing the damages being done by these same exact people that they keep letting out? As a good prosecutor, walk us through the process of prosecution of a crime, and where are we not connecting these dots? Where are we missing that? Where have we gotten to in society today with some of the district attorneys that are not recognizing the damages being done by some of the policies that they're doing?
Right. I mean, that's a good question, and I think back my time as U.S. attorney. And I had a unique district because I also was the DA in District of Columbia. So I had the local crimes as well as the federal crimes. So I had a very close working relationship with the Metropolitan Police Department, the officers from the chief on down. And I think that's the only way to do it. I think if you don't have a good relationship with the police, the DA, then you're not going to be able to effectively protect your community. And, the police are, not only first responders, but they're the investigators. They're the witnesses in the trials, and they are essential to this process. And I always listen to them because you pointed out, and this was true in DC, was that the police knew who the troublemakers were in the community. And they said, let's go after them. And, a lot of them already had a violent crime or a conviction, and they had guns. And that's a federal crime. felon in possession of a gun. So we had a program in DC where we got a lot of pushback from the judges and others in the community, the activist community that didn't want us making those prosecutions. But if you think about it, what is a felon doing with a firearm in the District of Columbia that doesn't even allow firearms, except to kill cops or to shoot up a neighborhood, enforce their drug laws, and have innocent people lost in the crossfire? And it was unacceptable. So we worked very closely with the police. So, we would have arrests, and the police would do the arresting, and we would work with them on policies about how we would charge each case. And sometimes that worked on the lower levels with my assistants and the commanders in the field. And sometimes the chief of police wanted to raise it up. And I responded to that because, especially when it came to me, I thought it was more important. One of the most important things was an assault on an officer. When an officer got assaulted, in my view, if that defendant is going to take a shot at a cop, or is going to, in one case, throw a Molotov cocktail at a cop in a car, what's he going to do to somebody who's unarmed, as an average citizen? They're more dangerous than anybody in society. And so that's why we have to get them off the street. And I was very strong on that, and worked very closely with MPD to make sure that those crimes were, definitely felonies. But if we had to take them to federal court, we could take them to federal court. And that was my, I had that luxury of being able to move things to federal court with a stroke of a pen, which doesn't always happen, because, as you point out, you may have a DA that doesn't want to do anything, and you don't know if you have a federal crime there, so you can't do it all the time. But I think having that close working relationship, having good prosecutors on the line that are going to be aggressive in their enforcement of the law, which is what we all take an oath to do. And then at the end of the day, you have to have good laws too. You have to be supportive. You can't have bail laws that allow people out, onto the street without any consequences. One story: when I was a federal U.S. attorney, and I went to these community meetings quite a bit, and I went to and this moved me a lot, because I went to a meeting, and it was full of locals that were in a very high crime area. With MPD came with me, and we heard them and listened. And one of the biggest complaint was not about our office or MPD; it was about the judges that let these people out every day. They had murders that happened in their next door, and they saw the guy that pulled the trigger on the street the next day. Now that makes it very difficult for police to investigate, because it intimidates witnesses. It makes it difficult for the people to live there, because they can't function, and they're afraid to in their own houses. That isn't right. And so as I was walking out, one woman came up to me and asked if she could show a picture of her daughter. I said, sure. So I she showed me a picture, beautiful, like 13-year-old daughter, class picture type of thing that you get at the schools. And I said, oh, she's beautiful. And that's nice. What's her name? That kind of thing. Then she said, I want to show you another picture. And she pulled out another picture of her purse, and it was her autopsy picture. Wow. And she had gotten shot in the neighborhood not too long ago, and the crime remained unsolved. And she asked that, we do whatever we can to bring justice. And I think that shows you the individual impact of this violent crime. And this is, as you mentioned, low income communities of color are the ones that are affected the most. And it was something that I'll never forget. The same when I was DEA administrator in Boston, we did a takedown, worked with the Boston PD, state police, and there was a whole housing project up there, low income housing, that was taken over by a drug gang. And people couldn't go out without their permission. They had people on the roof with guns. I mean, imagine living in a fear like that, not being able to send your kids to school, people getting caught in the crossfire. And so we used the federal law, and what happens at that point, we take them out using conspiracy, racketeering, and there's no parole in the federal system. So we take those guys out, and when they're arrested by the police and the DEA agents, they don't come back, because they're held in detention. Then they go to jail someplace in Indiana. So they're out of the picture. And that at least a sigh of relief until, for these people that live in these communities. And I think that's something as well. The other thing I think that people overlook the impact of violent crime, and this was true we try to identify this and actually work on this in the 90s, is the economic impact. Because there's no way you can have an economic small business in a community. You can have, people trying to earn a living through markets or laundries or things like that, small businesses, shops. If you're going to have bullets flying, that people aren't going to go to shop. You're not going to be able to feed your family and employ people. And that's because of the crime rates.
And it's not just that. I mean, a lot of cities have lowered the threshold of what crimes they're going to carry any kind of weight with. And I ask, if you're a mom and pop business that's struggling to get by every single day, how many $800 thefts can you handle before you have to close your doors?
Well,
and really a quality of a life and community has a lot of factors. And one is the availability of these very stores and the drugstores and the things that we're now seeing closing across this country. You're right. This is also an economic question. And that, again, I'll go back to what I said before. Why are we not connecting the dots and recognizing the impact of some of these policies that they're failed? At what point do we recognize that this failed policy is causing real lives? We talk about statistics, and I love your what you said about a mother, proud of her daughter, and then showing you that she's a victim of just the violence within a community. But I think often we talk about percentages of increase.
Right.
It's numbers. Numbers are impersonal. They don't care whether you like them or not. But the reality is numbers are really real families and lives that are forever changed because of the actions of district attorneys and judges that are living in the comfort of wherever they live, but they're certainly inflicting damage to the very communities that they swore that they would protect.
Well, you asked about the difference between 1990s and today, and that the one you identified is it. I didn't hear people saying they were going to not prosecute larcenies under a certain amount back then. I mean, people were trying to get a hold of the communities and trying to protect themselves and have the government asking them to do it. When we went into African-American communities back then, I was with the Attorney General, and they would be asking for help. They would be wanting federal officers there. They wanted the death penalty. They wanted these things where people were strong laws. Now you have people advocating for statutes like that, or actually DAs not fulfilling their oath of office to faithfully execute the laws by saying we're not going to prosecute this law at all. I mean, they're basically repealing the criminal law when they do that. What
they're doing is they're being malfeasance in office. It's I don't have the right as a law enforcement officer to decide what laws that I'm going to enact or not enact. Yet prosecutors somehow have been granted that position or that ability to do so by, I guess, a lack of accountability to people that they've
well, hopefully, as we saw in San Francisco, there will be some accountability. But I think that it's an abuse of discretion. When the prosecutorial discretion is real, and you need to do that. But what that means, it's a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the law needs to be adjusted to fit a particular situation if it's out of the ordinary. And that's where a prosecutor's judgment has to come in. But if you're just going to wholesale repeal a criminal statute by a fiat, by issuing a memo to your staff, that's wrong.
There's a way to do it. That's
right.
not it.
Go to the legislature.
That's it.
Have it changed.
It's a run for the legislature.
Right.
No, I absolutely
So
agree with you.
And even, small crime, like it looks innocuous, like a trespass. That's an important thing. You mentioned the small business in the low-income community. They can't call the police and get these bad people out of their stores because they can't arrest them for trespass and stop them from going in. That makes a huge difference to an individual in these communities that's trying to run a small business, obey the law, raise a family in the right way, and they're getting abused by the system, not only the criminal, but by the system.
Tim, even more. I mean, look at cities. Philadelphia, they limit the ability to do traffic stops. Chicago, they limit the ability to do foot chases, and the list goes on. You mentioned earlier, and unfortunately, anybody who's been in law enforcement more than a minute knows what broken windows is.
Right.
And broken windows it means a lot of things to different people, and unfortunately, it's kind of been hijacked because of some things that's been attached to, but. The premise is a little decay just encourages more. It's really the health of a community. So if you see a problem, fix the problem. It doesn't matter if what you're talking about. In this case, we're talking about the quality of life in a community. If you see vandalism, if you fix it. if you see decay, I would argue that the 21st century broken windows is prosecutors who won't do their job.
Right.
And that's where we find, unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves today, where law enforcement officers are doing their job. We're taking people off the streets. Incarceration is not the answer to everything. We recognize that. And look, the very powers we have in law enforcement are directly related to trust we have within our community. So we have some work to do. It's not an easy answer to all of these problems. But what we do know is we have empirical data to show that some of these things aren't working.
Right.
And at what point do we wake up and say, you know what? It's just not happening. It's not working. And the very people we say that we're trying to protect, well, we're not. Who is speaking for the victims?
Right. And I think that's a question that needs to be asked over and over again because, just in my experience, and I related a couple of the stories, but even when I was DEA administrator talking to parents whose children had died of overdoses from these drug dealers. And, I would go and we did prosecute some of these death resulting cases. And that to me is a violent crime where a drug dealer sells a fentanyl pill, fake pill that has a lethal dose in it. To me, that's, whether you shoot them with a gun or you give them a pill, to me, that's still dead.
Same. Yeah.
And so I think, here you've got a situation where you've got these DAs that are going out, not only, going after letting the revolving door continue through the bail acts, reduce sentencing, not charging what they should be charging for a crime and a lesser crime where they get no time. I mean, and then they go out and commit more crime because what is true before, which we fixed, which was most of the crimes or a lot of the crimes committed in this country are by people already under a criminal justice sentence, whether that's out on bail, probation, or parole in the state system. So you see these people that should be in jail and they're not incapacitated. That's why the crime rate's going up. Look at, you look at Chicago. That's got the most murders last year of any city in America, including compared to New York and LA, which have much larger populations. And you've got a DA there that's a rogue DA, and plus you've got a mayor that doesn't support the police. And the same is true with Philadelphia. You've got last year was the bloodiest year in Philadelphia in terms of homicides. It beat 1991, which was the record year. And that's still, again, more than all those other big cities. And that's a relatively small city compared to some of the others in this country. So, with that DA and his unapologetic, approach to law enforcement, I don't know how they take that oath when they don't enforce the law.
Absolutely. Tim, you do have an interesting perspective in the fact that as the U.S. attorney here in Washington, you did basically the DA and the federal side. So if you could just walk us through a little bit of what that process is on the DA side. Historically, we've talked about all of the results that we're having, but what links are DAs missing that in previous time that they recognized that helped us lower that crime rate? What's the steps that they're doing wrong? And then if you could kind of stretch that over to the federal side, if the local district attorneys are not doing it, we had a meeting with President Trump under. In fact, you were at that meeting where we talked about those very things about the lack of prosecution in some of these cities and the need for federal government to step in on the federal side and take over some of these violent gun crimes because it's so pervasive in all of our communities. Walk a little bit through that process. Right. What missing links? What links are we missing on the local side, and how can we reverse that course? I mean, obviously it's not working. The data's there.
Right. I think, again, I think it's an example is a good way to illustrate it, but there are a couple of principles involved with the DA. When I was a federal prosecutor, a line prosecutor doing these violent crime cases, there was a case out in Virginia, right outside of Washington on a military base, which is why I had federal jurisdiction. And the FBI investigated it. And it was a 20-year-old in a car sitting shotgun and saw these two teenagers on the side of the road walking down. One had a camouflage jacket, and back then in the 90s, it was, that was a prized thing. So he said, "I want that jacket." So he told the kid to pull the car over. The shooter got out with his gun, and demanded the jacket, and then he changed, so he had a pocket full, like $8 in his change. And then when he said, "Get out of here," the guy, and then he started shooting at the kids on a federal land. I said, "This is incredible." And then we finally found him a few days later. But the real interesting point is that I looked at his rap sheet. He's only 20 years old. He had 21 arrests and didn't spend a day in jail. And I said to myself, this kid, the next time this kid shows up, it's going to be in a murder case. And so thank God those kids weren't hit by those bullets. So we went to trial and I didn't let him plead out. He had no parole in the federal system. He got, the maximum amount, the judge, because I told the judge the next crime is going to be a murder here. And that's because it goes back to your point. If he had been stopped in the system and had seen the consequences of his actions early in his criminal career, maybe he wouldn't have been at that point. But we had to protect society, because if we can't let somebody like that out, he may have been a first time in jail, but that's not the first time he's committed a crime, obviously, right, because he had been arrested. So it goes back to the revolving door where these DAs are making decisions and letting people out on bail, number one. That should be in jail. That causes discomfort in the community. It causes witness intimidation. It's frustrating for the police because they see the people out on bail, and then they don't charge the case. They null process the case on a DA level, and the police are out there arresting them the next day for the same crime. And their police are doing their job, but the DAs aren't, and that's where the system breaks down. You have to be consistent in the enforcement of the law. That's your duty as a district attorney. You take an oath to do that. On the federal system, in the federal system, we have a little more discretion, but at the same time, you have to be consistent and fair in how you support the law, whether it's felon in possession when you're doing violent crime cases, or the drug, trafficking cases with the cartels, and then in the street gangs that are the major gangs in this country. So I think for me, those are the big disconnects that you see with the district attorneys that are not doing their job. And there's a lot of them there are, I have to say. I mean, I still stay in touch with them, and they're doing a great job.
Tale of two cities.
Right. And you see that, and you see them working hard, and they're getting a bum rap by some of them, even the next jurisdiction over, where they're letting people out of jail. And that's crazy.
Yeah. And we can't discredit, we have to look at, another crisis we're having in this country is the ability to be able to backfill. We're losing officers at a rate we've never lost before. Right. Retirements are up. Officers are finding more stable professions. And so it's creating the best and brightest are not stepping forward to take this job because all the damage that's done. Well, you can see where there's the lack of prosecution, the lack of district attorneys doing their part of the job, how it's adding to an epidemic, in my opinion, of something that cannot happen overnight. We can't fix it overnight. If we flipped a switch today and said, everybody loves the police and we want you to come work, and we had 1,000 applicants for every open position we had, and they were qualified applicants, and we hired them and put them in academy, we're still looking 3, 4, 5 years before they finish the training effective officers. But we've lost so much experience, putting so much burden on the officers that are there now. And in many cases, these same district attorneys are more focused on damaging them than they are keeping criminals off the street.
Right. And Pat, that's an excellent question. This was a big concern of mine when I was DA administrator, because, during that whole unrest and the funding and the defund the police movement, I gave them their badges. I had to address them at their graduations. And I brought this up. I really appreciated them stepping up at a very difficult time and joining the DEA. And I also saw it when I traveled around the country, because the DEA can't do its job without state and local law enforcement. And we partner with them all the time in the task forces, and they are critical to our mission. And we would not be able to do it without them. And so for me, I spent a lot of time with the state and local police because it was essential to our mission. And you could see the toll it was taking. That these DAs in these cities, that we would go to Chicago, or St. Louis was another one it was very difficult. And as in some ways we benefited because they gravitated to the feds because we were actually doing something with it. And we could actually, when the DAs weren't doing their job, we could go in and use federal law and take those people out and do it as hard as we could in those cities. And that's what we kind of did with and one of the examples of that is Operation Legend, which we started, and it was done in like 10 cities around the country. Attorney General Barr did it. We participated as well as DEA, where you marshaled the federal resources of ATF, FBI, DEA, and then together, working with the state and locals, we went into these high crime neighborhoods and tried to give some relief. And that's when it was ticking up back then, but now it's beyond control. Yeah. It's beyond belief what the crime rates are.
You know, I love something that you pointed out earlier. You know, we talk about the demands that are on the system because there's so many people. You know, incarceration. We have the highest incarceration of any other nation. Right. At the same time, we also need to recognize that some people just need to be kept out of society. They are the ones that are causing the havoc. So until we address all of the root causes of crime, we really need to be able to take certain people off the streets. You know, law enforcement is not responsible for poverty. We're not responsible for failed school systems, not responsible for broken family units, any of those things. Yet in a lot of ways, you know, we kind of lump all that together and say law enforcement's not doing their job. There really needs to be a bigger approach of how we're going to address the rising crimes in communities. And it comes back to a simple thing. There are so many aspects to equality to the health of a community. And law enforcement is one of them. Prosecutors are one of them. Judges, they're all parts of it. And when we're not working together, that's exactly what you're seeing. Exactly. So if in these cities to where we're struggling and we're seeing that crime rate up, what is the trigger? What brings in? When does federal step in and say, okay, we're going to take some of these cases? What triggers that step?
Right. Well, in all of these cities, there is a federal presence that works on a task force level. So the FBI, the ATF, the DEA. All have federal state task forces, violent crime task forces that work with the locals all the time. So a lot of the targets are set jointly by the local police and the federal. In fact, at DEA, we even had, and I was surprised at this, but I was pleasantly surprised that some of our task forces, DEA-led task forces, were actually led by a local cop, which was impressive because they did a good job and they were the best ones for the job. So we put them in charge and they were TFO. But I think we would, on the federal level, and let's take the drugs, for example. I mean, we would go after, this is how it should work. We would go after the organization itself and then use the federal laws like conspiracy, racketeering, so that we could capture as many people as possible, from the kingpin, if it goes back, and many times it did, to Mexico, to the drug cartels in Mexico, all the way to the streets of St. Louis. And we would take that organization, investigate it, work up the indictments, and then indict and arrest. And some of them would go state, some of them would go federal, depending on how culpable they were. So that's how it should work. And it does in a lot of areas. And we take out these, like I mentioned in Boston, we take out a whole organization and it gives relief to a community. But when you don't have the local prosecutor, then we have to do it on our own and try to help as much as we can. But it depends on how big the person is and what their role is in the conspiracy.
Yeah. And again, you said earlier that that intervention at an earlier age and holding accountable at an earlier, early on, probably could divert a lot of these people away from that violent path.
Right.
And we're missing it. We're missing that point. That's so vitally important. What are you hearing? I know you still are very connected across the country with prosecutors and your counterparts, people, your colleagues that you worked so many years. What are you hearing from them about the state of where we are now, at least sort of prosecutors' viewpoint?
Well, I think many of them are just, they can't. They're just outraged by the increase in violent crime. I mean, it's something that needs to be done. Some of them are frustrated by the fact that they're getting bad publicity because some of these DAs that are not doing their jobs are out there, and people are exposing them, and they should, but it doesn't, they have to deal with that that fallout, as well as the fallout of the criminals that then move into their jurisdiction. They have to deal with them as well. So I think you're seeing a lot of frustration with some of the DAs. And I think that the other piece of it is the defund police, the anti-police movement, which I think was unfortunate that they have to deal with too, because again, as we mentioned and discussed, the prosecutors can't do their job without the police. And so if they don't have strong support and resources from the police to investigate the crimes and to be the witnesses and all that, the DAs can't do their jobs either.
It is a lot of dynamics that are at play here. But if you look at the whole defunding discussion and where we were, we found a period of time, an incident happened 8 minutes and 46 seconds on the street of Minneapolis. We all look at it and we scratch our head saying, okay, there's a lot of stuff we need to analyze here, things we need to fix, things that need to be done differently. And look, every law enforcement officer wants to improve the criminal justice system. That's why we exist. At the same time, we found ourselves in a period where academics and people who had no practical experience were dictating policy, and this whole defunding, it kind of felt in it fell in a time where it took hold, but it did take long to realize that this wasn't working. And in a lot of places, and I got to give credit where it's at, I'm less concerned to how we got there. I think history will record that, and I don't want to spend my time looking at defunding. What I will tell you now is we're at a point now where we've done a corrected course, and I think funding is higher than it's ever been before. We find ourselves in a position now where we're getting away from that ship sailed, the whole defunding part, but the damage was done. Mm-hmm. The damage was done, and again, Congress is looking at ways to fix the damage that was done, and so I'm encouraged by that part. What I'd like to feel is encouraged that now we're moving on to the other problem. The other problem is prosecutors that are not doing their jobs, right? And I'd love to say that the trend is there, true, as well, but I'm just simply not seeing it. We focus all the energy in blaming law enforcement, and in reality, the criminal justice system, law enforcement is just only one part of it. Right. And we are completely ignoring what I see is a very big problem here. If we don't get a handle on it, it's going to continue to spiral out of control. Right. So again, while I'm encouraged to see that we're now moving in a little bit different direction and that the whole defunding and recognizing the damage that was done and trying to put it back in place. Again, I just don't see it happening on the prosecution side. Right. So with that, I'll let you, any final thoughts before we close up?
No, I just, I want to appreciate all your leadership in the FOP, because I think highlighting this issue of rogue prosecutors is so important. And I think it does have an impact on, as we discussed, on everyday people. And people have to realize that what's causing it. And I think it's important to realize that the election of a DA is very, very important. It affects the quality of life of people, affects public safety. And I think that if we don't pay attention, it can be life and death of somebody. And for police, it's important too, because it's a difference between getting a fair shake and a review or getting persecuted. And I've seen that myself firsthand. And so I think it's something that you have to have a good DAs, and to do that. So it's paying attention to those. We took for granted all these years that people who ran for that office were interested in following the law, but apparently that's not true. So I put that out as just pay attention to these elections, because they're crucial.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you for joining us again. It's been a great working with you over the years. I've always admired the way you've approached stuff, and found solutions to problems. So appreciate all you do. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you for spending some time with us on the Blue View, where we talk about the things that are vitally important to the men and women who suit up and show up every single day in communities across America and protect those they swore to protect and serve. So thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. See you next time.